Welcome to the Digital Agency Growth Podcast. I'm your host, Dan Englander. Today on the show, I'm very excited to welcome back Marcel Petitpas. Marcel is the CEO and co-founder of Parakeeto, which is a company dedicated to helping agencies measure and improve their profitability by streamlining their operations and reporting systems. He's also the head strategic coach at SaaS Academy by Dan Martell, which is the #1 coaching program for B2B SaaS businesses in the world. Marcel, great to have you back on the show.
Thanks for having me, Dan. It's good to see you again.
Yeah, I was digging back through the archives. So we spoke in spring of 2022, I think, last. And correct me if I'm wrong, if memory serves, I think at that point, you were kind of pivoting the business to more of a managed service model and I think deproductizing. So assuming I have that right, how have things gone over the last couple of years?
Yeah, when we last spoke, we were still trying really hard to be a software company. And at that point, we had just kind of come to the realization that agencies need much more help than just software in order to solve this problem of measuring and managing profitability. And in particular, I think the revelation at that time was we as an industry have typically focused on this problem of measuring metrics in the business in terms of this binary spectrum of clean inputs that go straight into standardized structured outputs. So make sure your team is entering all of the time tracking and project and finance data perfectly, and then you automatically zap all of that into this dashboard and it's problem solved. And what we figured out after working with over 100 agencies to try and solve this problem is this idea of the team puts in all of the data perfectly doesn't happen ever. It's just impossible. And trying to control for that is a fool's errand. You're gonna basically, if you can get militant enough about managing inputs and the structure of inputs, you're gonna have bad compliance. So you just can't win at that game. And for that reason, we really got focused on the problem in the middle, which is assuming that we get inconsistent, imperfect, constantly changing data structures and data inputs, how do we still get good reporting outputs? And the answer is, well, you do what enterprise has been doing for decades, which is called data operations. And you have an extract, transform, and load framework. And that transform piece in the middle is the most critically important part of all of this, because it's what allows you to change the tools that you use, change the way you structure things, change what you call things, have mistakes in the data, and have a step in the process where you catch all of those things. And then you have an opportunity to correct them before you send that information into a set of reports that you're then going to use to make decisions. And it saves you from ending up in this position where you just learn not to trust your reports and therefore you don't use them. And then this whole exercise of reporting is for nothing. And that's where a service became really important, because just in the same way that you need bookkeepers and accountants to make sure your accounting data is clean, you kind of need the same thing for your ops data. So that was a transition that we made, and it's worked out extremely well for us. I mean, we were just talking before the show, we're growing really fast. We're finally really helping clients fully solve this problem and focus on the things that are most important. And it's been a really kind of incredible learning experience going down this path and really kind of letting go of our constraints of saying we want to be a software company because we like that idea, and focusing more on what do we actually need to do to fully solve this problem in the best way possible.
Yeah, it's super interesting. And this sort of extract, transform, convert way of framing it, it seems like it's a microcosm of a bigger picture where we're over the days of where SaaS was going to let you click 2 buttons and solve this big, hairy, audacious problem. And everybody kind of fell down to earth. It reminds me of in the outbound world, we've worked with countless agencies that sign up for whatever, Zoom Info and Apollo, click 2 buttons, and all of a sudden, nothing comes of it after doing outbound campaigns. And it turns out there's a whole QC layer in the middle that's not fun, but it's really necessary to hey, is this actually a fintech company? Turns out AI can't even really do that very well yet. You still have to have a human look at it and say, okay, this is fintech and not a bank or something. So it reminds me of a lot of other things that I've seen. I think you just did an interesting post about this, and maybe it's a good segue to what do you think of the SaaS world now? What do you think the promise of a modern day software company is from an investment or opportunity perspective?
So this is a hot take. I mean, it's people say that it's a hot take. I think it's actually not that outlandish of a thing to say, but if you think about a software company over the last 2 decades, because there's been this kind of like zero interest rate environment. Venture capital has been so easy to come by. You had companies like SoftBank that were just pouring endless amounts of money into companies and subsidizing essentially their go to market so that there was this unbalanced value equation. So you take like WeWork, for example. Adam Newman was successful because he took $1,000 worth of co-working and he sold it for $200. Anybody can make money selling a $100 bill for $20. And the reason he was able to do that was because SoftBank was subsidizing your WeWork membership in the same way that Uber rides were subsidized by SoftBank for the first 5 or 6 years of Uber's existence. And now all of a sudden, the market is correcting those things because that venture capital is not there. And that was pervasive throughout SaaS, in my opinion, where there's this fallacy about software companies that they have like 95% gross margins and they're infinitely scalable. And all you have to do to scale a software company is spin up more and more server infrastructure. But the reality is there's actually a ton of human capital needed to scale a software company. You need support, you need onboarding, you need customer success. At the enterprise level, you need implementation teams and custom integrations, and you need training for the team and account management, a lot of the same stuff that you need inside of a consulting or agency type business. The issue is they were just calling those things customer success, support, onboarding, training, and doing them for free and hiding that basically in the P&L as overhead as opposed to COGS. And they were letting venture capital pay for those things and waiting 24, 36 months to become profitable on a client after they've been subscribed for that long. But now that venture capital has corrected the valuation of all these companies and it's not as easy to come by, and now they're focused on profitability, I think what you're going to see is the way software companies used to be back in the 90s, where they charged for all of these things and called them professional services. And at the enterprise level, there's still lots of people that do this. I mean, we saw HubSpot, they were charging implementation fees. ClickUp now has an implementation team. They charge for implementation. So a lot of people, when I start talking about this, think that I'm suggesting that software companies are going to start doing a whole bunch of new services. My perspective is they've always been doing services. They just haven't monetized them before. And I think you're going to start to see them monetize services more often, more frequently. It'll become a more standard kind of part of the model. And there's a benefit to that, which is rather than seeing them now as a cost center, they will actually become potentially a profit center. And at the very least, charging for these things will allow them to put more resources into solving the full spectrum of a customer's problem. Because the reason those things exist is because often the software can't fully solve the problem. And these supports, these human supports, are a really important part of really kind of getting someone from point A to point B, which is why they bought the software in the first place, was for the outcome, for the transformation.
Yeah, it's super interesting. I don't think I've ever put it that eloquently, but I've had similar thoughts. I remember this was before I owned a business or anything, so I won't say I had any like crazy foresight, but I remember being in WeWork because we used to work there at like the heyday of WeWork when they were just exploding in terms of valuation. And somebody like turned to me and they're like, the value to WeWork is the data they have underneath it. And I remember thinking like, what data? You mean just like people buying staplers or something? Yeah. So there's that Eric Weinstein quote, we look for our blind spots so we can do business there. And there's just all sorts of examples of that. People just kind of like, we all do it. We all just say, I don't understand this, but it's cool that the number's going up. So let's just get on board. So that's super interesting. I think, what that sounds like is good news for the agency model, or at least some version of the agency model that's sort of been like, well, the grass is greener with software. It would be great to have something like that. But it turns out maybe the grass isn't as green as we thought over there. With that in mind, what does making an agency more profitable look like now? And has that changed at all since we last spoke or since you first started focusing on this problem?
Yeah, I feel that the agency space is going through the same maturity curve that every industry goes through. It's kind of the law of economics that the longer an industry exists, the lower the margins in that industry become, because more competition enters that industry, more sophisticated players enter that industry, and there is increased competition. And we've seen, if you think about the last decade, and in particular since COVID pushed remote work and therefore the globalization of skilled labor in the context of agencies forward by a decade. So this kind of globalization effect in professional services, creative services was rapidly accelerated. So now if you're like a North American firm, you're competing against firms all over the world, many of which have a dramatically lower cost basis for their operations than you do. You have AI now that's also compounding all of this. And so basically the pressure on margins just continues to come. And what I've observed in the industry is over the last decade or so, there's three main things that we've been talking about to try and combat the erosion of margin that's existed in the past. Pricing models. So we went from in the 90s, early 2000s, where everybody just billed by the hour for everything, to now most small firms have multiple pricing models, many of which are productized services, value-based pricing, flat retainers, and they're trying to arbitrage their efficiency. Say, we're going to charge a flat rate for this and then spend less time to make a higher margin. We've seen them embrace more positioning and niching down so that they could command a higher price point for their services by basically having a more expert positioning. And we've seen them really adopt project management and project management software. So it's kind of table stakes now to have those three things in your business. You got to be clear about who you serve, have a good, strong positioning. You've got to, have a good pricing model, and you've got to have some kind of project management system so that you're on top of delivering things efficiently. So now the question is, okay, that's table stakes. If we can understand that almost every agency is doing all three of those things, well, what's next? Because the margin pressure just keeps coming. And I believe that we're crossing over this chasm where in order to run an agency in 2024 and beyond, you can't just be a talented creative. You also have to be a reasonably sophisticated business owner, because there's just not enough margin for you to get away with not understanding your own business model and not paying attention to the numbers and the levers that are available to you. And so I think an increased focus on data and numbers and really understanding why you are unprofitable and what to do about it is one part of it. And I think the other thing is something I call internal specialization. So on top of saying this is who we serve and being really specific about that in terms of externally, the clients that you work with, I think those same kind of conversations are going to have to start happening internally, where we say, hey, our strengths as operators is sales, marketing, and client relationships, but we're actually pretty bad at delivery and like delivery operations. And so we're going to focus on sales and marketing and account management, and we're going to partner with like white label or third-party vendors to like actually deliver a lot of these services that we don't have an interest or the skill set to scale internally. And by doing that, you'll be able to basically get more specific about what part of the supply chain you're going to specialize in and get really efficient and really good at operating in that space, in the same way that we've seen in almost every other industry that is very mature, where you just see the supply chain get increasingly fragmented because people become specialized in an operational sense more and more. So I think those are kind of two of the big trends we're going to see over the next decade to try and combat, again, the margin pressure that just is not going anywhere.
Yeah, that makes sense. So to recap, positioning is table stakes, i.e. we serve this sort of market, we solve this type of problem, here's what makes us different, et cetera. Moving on to internal specialization, we do these specific things. Here's how we solve that problem. I'm sure there's not one answer, but can you talk a little bit about how you're helping agencies land on that? So if they've got all these different things they do, what's the process you're going through to help them uncover what internal specialization looks like?
The long and short is, it's really quite simple, actually. We start with looking at average billable rate or delivery margin across different vectors in the business. And usually it's going to be some form of service line or product or project breakdown. And often when you have an agency that's been doing stuff for a while, you can very quickly see, hey, this service that you sell is vastly, like significantly more profitable than this other service that you sell. Or even if you took a service and you looked at what is the value chain within that service. So you build websites, you do really, really well on the strategy and design phases of the website. But as soon as it goes to development, that's when shit goes off the rails. You consistently go over budget. You lose a lot of the margin that you made in that first half of the project. And that's where you might have this recognition of saying, look, maybe your strength operationally is in selling websites, defining the strategy and designing them. And you should just stop trying to do development internally and de-risk your business and also simplify your business and make it easier to scale by partnering with someone that can own that piece and is really an expert in doing that. And what we've seen is that while you are giving a chunk of your revenue away to a third party, generally what happens is the margins on the revenue that's left over go way up. And so you have higher quality revenue while letting go of a little bit of the quantity. But in doing that, often these companies are able to scale much faster and do so with a lot more cash flow.
Yeah, the one analogy that I'm not sure if I thought of it, I think I did though. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. Is like Tim Ferriss actually talks about this, I think, in his big fitness book, whatever it was called years ago, and it was like references the idea that, yeah, it was like the size of the Bible basically, but it's the idea that like it used to be, calories are calories. Like if you get your calories from potato chips or grass-fed beef, it's the same thing. And now we know that's like going to be further from the truth. A calorie from potato chip is going to set you back way more. And it almost feels like dollars are kind of the same way. Like if you get, depending on what the product is and what you had to do for them and everything like that. What do you think of that analogy?
Well, yeah, I mean, it makes sense. And in business, it's like very objective because it comes down to margin, right? It's like, it's possible that I could sell something as a service business. Like I could sell you something for $1 and I could spend $2 in labor to get it done. So that dollar of revenue is actually costing me money. And that happens all the time in service businesses where way more time goes into something than we thought. And we actually lose money. We pay to work with the client. And on the flip side, you could sell something to a client that takes you almost no time, almost no energy to deliver, and have an absurdly high margin. And so focusing on that quality of revenue, to your point, and which really just comes down to where am I making the most margin, is a really important thing to evaluate inside of a service-based business, because the constraint in a service-based business is time. And so if we understand that, let's say I have 5,000 hours of time on my team and I pay a certain amount of money for that each month. If I sell 5,000 hours for $100 an hour, then you do the math on that, I can make $500,000. Yeah, $500,000 with that team. But if I can sell that same time for an average of $200 per hour, then I can double the amount of money that I make without changing the cost basis. It sounds too simple to be true, but that's really how it works. And basically making more per hour, there's two ways that you can do that. You can increase the amount of money that you charge for an hour. That's obvious. But the other way that's equally effective is you could spend half as much time to earn that same dollar of revenue. And both of those have the exact same impact on your earning efficiency per hour, which is like the basal unit of this business model that relies on human capital being resold at a profit. And, whether you like to think of your business model that way or not, that is how services are defined. And it's how the vast majority of agencies are structured, as you know.
Yeah. And with that in mind, I'd love to get into some examples that you've seen with your clients about disrupting that model towards profitability. I think we both know Greg Hickman, who's doing a lot of work in the space and alt agency and everything like that.
Yeah.
But I'd love to hear what you're seeing out there.
Yeah. And I mean, there's a bit of tension in all of this where there is a narrative out there, which is selling time is just like a fundamentally flawed business model. And so you should abandon that business model and start selling courses or start selling software or do a group coaching program. And for some people, that might be the right answer. It might be that they just can't or don't want to or won't enjoy scaling the service-based business model. So what I want to offer today is the perspective of like, well, let's assume that you don't want to completely change your business model. It must be possible that there is a way to make the service-based business model very profitable and feasible. I believe that to be true. I believe that to be true because I've seen it. And so what needs to be true for that to happen? If you have figured out how to solve a problem and there's a need for it, you know that you can do it well. How do you just make sure that your business model is healthy? How do we understand the business model well enough to take control over it and to keep it healthy, even when maybe we run into pricing pressure, even when maybe we run into increased labor costs? This is me like rambling a little bit about, I think it's important to differentiate between saying, how do we like pivot to a completely different business model versus how do we actually just increase the efficiency of this service-based business model that does rely on reselling time in some way. So I'm going to stop talking for a minute so that with that qualification in place, and then we can dig into the question.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think that's what our listeners would be going for, is like not necessarily blowing everything up and just becoming a training business as we're starting to do. That makes sense.
Which, by the way, there's nothing wrong with. And, Parakeeto, I would say for ourselves, like we are definitely trying to create purely software-based revenue inside of our business. In fact, we already have, and that's going really well. So it's not to say that those aren't legitimate paths, but yeah, back to the question. So you have a service-based business model. How do you increase the efficiency of it? If we take out decreasing your overhead costs, let's just assume that, okay, that's like easy. There's nothing complicated about that. And to be honest, in having looked at hundreds of agencies, I could count on one hand in 6 years the number of agencies that we've looked at that actually had an overhead spending problem, that they were just like spending too much on accounting and software and beanbag chairs and had too many perks at the office. Like that almost never happens. 98% of the agencies that we've looked at and that are listening would have a gross margin problem, or as I like to call it, delivery margin, because I don't want to argue with accountants over semantic issues. So what is delivery margin? Well, it's the relationship between $1 of revenue and what it costs you to earn that $1 of revenue. So to be more specific, if Dan, you come to me and you say, Marcel, I want you to build me a website. And I say, great, Dan, that website's going to cost you $100,000. My delivery margin is how much of that $100,000 is left over after I have incurred all of the cost of building you that website, the time that goes into it, maybe the software tools that my team is using to like help them design things and do QA testing and write GitHub commits, etc. So once I look at like all of the costs that went into earning that revenue and delivering on the promise that was made to you, how much is left over? And what we want when we look at the profit and loss statement of a service-based business is to have at least 50 cents of every dollar left over. So we can then pay for all the overhead, which is acquiring customers, marketing, administration, facilities, rent, all of those things, and then hopefully have 20 to 30% left over. And the higher that delivery margin is, the easier it is to be profitable and the more optionality we have to push that money back into the business for growth, to pull it out as profit. So to me, the foundation of a healthy service-based business is having a high delivery margin. And I've seen many service-based businesses that are really sophisticated, really focused on this, get to 75, 80% delivery margins, which I believe if you were to adjust most software companies for how much of their research and development, customer success, support costs are actually a COGS, it's very close to what a lot of software companies are actually operating at. So a service-based business can be extremely profitable, extremely healthy. And if you want, we can dig into really the only three ways that you can increase that delivery margin. There's three simple numbers that really drive that.
Yes, let's do that. And then I also want to talk about cost of acquisition, which maybe you're planning to do anyway, but I'll give you the floor.
All right. So by the way, if you want to dig into like the nuances of delivery margin, how to calculate it, there's some resources on our website that you can go dig into. We give all of that away for free. But let's assume that you do some quick napkin math and you figure out like, okay, we earned $1 million in revenue last year, about 400K of payroll and software went to that. So, or let's say 600K of payroll and software into that. So I have a 40% delivery margin. Marcel just said I need to be at 50% or more. So I have a problem now. I need to increase that number. How do I do that? And there's really only three operational metrics that you can focus on that if those are healthy, your P&L will start to look healthier. The first one is average cost per hour. And average cost per hour is a simple number that you can use to look at, across different services that you sell, across different time horizons. What did an hour of labor cost you on average? And to the extent that you can systematically lower that number, what should happen is on the profit and loss statement, your delivery cost and payroll will not grow as fast as your income does. Because as you hire people, as you bring on more freelance labor, for example, those people will become less and less expensive. And the way that you do that in practice is you take something that a $100,000 employee does and you try to create better documentation, better systems, better processes, better training internally so that someone who maybe only costs $50,000 an hour can start doing more and more of that work. And as you do that, the composition of your team over time will change. And instead of having to go out and hire 5 new $100,000 employees next year, you maybe hire 2 of those and the other 3 are far less expensive. So you start to create a separation between your revenue growth and your cost growth, and you increase your margin over time. And if you have freelancers on your team, it's just going to be a lower latency because you incur the cost of freelancers much more immediately than you would like realize a change in the cost of your team over time, because that would require hiring people, firing people, or growing the team to start to see that benefit. So that's metric number 1 is average cost per hour. And that's a proxy for the delivery cost side of your margin equation.
That's super interesting. And it just sort of makes me think that everything's going back to the agency model moving towards the development of IP in perspective, because it's either you're developing IP to teach a lower level employee how to be a higher level employee, or you're developing that IP to sell directly to people. Would love to hear your thoughts on that, though.
Yes, this is exactly kind of where my thesis of internal specialization comes from. And like external specialization is a great forcing function to say, you need to develop a point of view or, IP or frameworks or a methodology for how you do what you do. And that will help you charge more, create more confidence with clients that you're going to solve the problem, have them trust you more. But internally, it also allows you to get much more streamlined about what you do and how you do things. And to your point, there's a lot of efficiencies that come with that, including being able to train employees up instead of having to go out and hire for that skill set. And if you're like us at Parakeeto, the problem we have is we could go hire the most experienced people in the industry and we still have to train the shit out of them because our framework is so unique. And a lot of times, the more experienced someone is, the more things they need to unlearn in order to help people in the way that our framework does. So yeah, to that end, to your point, that clarity on how you do things, what you do really does help make the whole business more efficient on top of allowing you to charge more. And so you stretch your margin from both ends in that respect.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Were there other points you wanted to cover related to COGS? And then I have a question or two about, yeah,
The
CAC.
other 2 points are related to how you increase the amount of revenue that you can earn with the cost that you already have in your business. So the first one I just talked about was about decreasing the delivery costs. The next two are the question of, okay, our delivery cost is what it is. How do we earn more revenue with the team that we have? And there's two metrics that will determine that. The first is average billable rate, which is a measure of for every hour that our team spends doing work for clients, how much revenue do we earn? And what's great about this metric is it allows you to normalize and compare anything that you sell no matter how you charge for it. So you could be selling one thing over here that's hourly, another thing over here that's value priced, another thing over here that's like a monthly retainer. And the average billable rate normalizes all of them. And you can look at them all through exactly the same lens because all we care about is what amount of money did we collect from the client and how many hours did we spend to get that thing, to get the promise delivered, to earn the revenue. And when you start to measure that, you start to see, hey, this thing over here, on average, we earn $200 for every hour that we spend on it. And this thing over here, on average, we earn $100 for every hour that we spend on it. That's interesting. And then you can start to have interesting conversations about that. Should we sell more of the thing that we make $200 an hour on? Should we make some changes to the thing that we only make $100 per hour on? And again, the only two ways to improve that metric are charge more money without increasing the amount of time it takes you, or spend less time without changing the amount of money that you charge. Both of those have the same effect on average billable rate. And the last piece is utilization. What percentage of the time that you buy from your team is spent earning that average billable rate? And of course, if you can go from spending 50% of your time to 60% of your time, you effectively increase the amount of money that you make by 10%. And the impact that a small tweak to all three of those metrics can have on your profitability is absolutely absurd. And I could walk through a mathematical model of that, but a 20% increase in utilization and a 25% increase in average billable rate could increase your profitability from 10% to 40% on the bottom line. So when you really start playing with these numbers, you see that they're really, really powerful and they're also very simple. But the important thing to not conflate that with is moving them being easy. It's not easy to move these numbers, but they are simple.
Yeah, that's usually how it goes. Simple but hard problems, produce giant results and all. So to move on to cost of acquisition a little bit, I think that one of the bigger problems we see is that it's just this hazy tunnel that agencies start going into when they're trying to get outside of referrals. And a lot of the times there's research done and they're like, well, I think that our close rate should be this, or I think that I'm going to take what I've gotten from referrals and then try to transpose it into some other channel I don't understand and then have a baseline. So like one thing that we tell people to do more, or we not recommend people do, is just figure out where you're at and then improve that first. So there's going to be this learning period of just establishing your numbers, just like when you go to a doctor, they take your reading and they tell you, your BPM needs to improve to this or whatever it might be. I guess like to bring this to what you're actually up to, can you talk a little bit about those benchmarks? You talked about that 50% number for COGS. Like what does CIC look like? Sure, what should CIC look like?
It's a great question. And there's a couple of different lenses that we can look at this question through. So I'll start with kind of the most fundamental, simplest lens, which is the reason that we want a delivery margin of at least 50% on the profit and loss statement is because we can generally expect to spend about 30% of our income on overhead. Overhead typically breaks down into three major categories. The first one is administration. So that's lawyers, accountants, payroll, HR, like all of the administrative expenses running the business. You're generally going to see that land somewhere in the 8 to 12, maybe 14% range of your income going towards that. The next one is facilities, which is anywhere from 0 if you're a remote team up to 6% if you have an office on the high end. And then the last bucket being sales and marketing, which we typically see fall anywhere from 8 to 14%. But if you have a 0% facilities cost, or if you're really efficient on admin, most of the time when you have excess budget for overhead or you have really high delivery margins, the place you're going to overinvest tends to be sales and marketing because it should correlate to you growing faster or bring in high quality revenue. So it's not alarming for us to see an agency spending 18, 20, even 25% of their income on sales and marketing, as long as they're either hyper efficient on overhead and or they have really strong delivery margins. And so they can just afford to make that discretionary decision to say, we're going to overinvest in this area of sales and marketing because we value the growth. We're going to basically place a bet on that. So at the highest level, those are the percentages of income that we expect to see spent on acquiring customers. Then the second vector that we want to think about that on is cash flow. And that's a really important thing to consider is like, what is the cash conversion cycle actually on the acquisition cost of a customer? Because that is, in some contexts, more important than the absolute cost of acquiring that customer.
Can you talk more about that?
Yeah. So the simple idea here, this is a really common one in software. It's called customer acquisition cost payback time. And the big idea there is when you take $1 of revenue and then you apply your gross margin to that. So let's say you make $1 of revenue, you have a 70% margin on that. So basically 70 cents is what you earn when you acquire that customer. Well, if you invest $1 in marketing, how long does it take you to make that back on, what your revenue is after factoring your gross margin? So to give you an example, if I spend $100 to acquire a customer and that customer pays me $10 a month and I have a 70% margin on that, I make $7 a month on that customer. So if I divide 100 by 7, that will tell me how many months it takes me to actually start making a profit on that customer. And I'm not great at math, but yeah, 100 divided by 7, you can figure that that's like over a year. It's a long time to wait to make that money back. And then when you think about, okay, I want to grow at a certain rate. So I want to acquire 10 customers a month. That means I need to tie up $1,000 a month in order to grow at a rate of 10 customers a month. And if it takes me, let's call it 12 months to make that money back, then I need to tie up a total of $12,000 in marketing at all times and in customer acquisition at all times to maintain that growth rate before I actually start to see cash get converted back from that cycle. This is important because most businesses, especially service-based businesses that have not raised external funding, are cash constrained. So of course, more realistic figures would be like, it costs me $1,000 to acquire a customer and I want to add 10 a month and it takes me 12 months to make that money back. So if you don't have a couple $100,000 to tie up in sales and marketing, then you will not be able to grow at that rate. You will run into cash flow issues along the way. So to the extent that you can shorten your cash conversion cycle, you need less money tied up in marketing and sales at any given moment to maintain a certain growth rate, which means that you are able to grow faster. So that is a function of both decreasing customer acquisition costs, but also very importantly, being able to pull cash forward in the customer lifecycle. So for example, if you charged a monthly fee, if you were able to get paid up front for the first 3 months or charge an onboarding fee on the front end of that, that could really change how long it takes you to make that money back and therefore really change the picture of how much cash needs to get tied up to maintain a certain growth rate. So that was a long and maybe somewhat complicated idea, but we can beat it up a little bit because it's really important to think about the cash impact that customer acquisition has.
Yeah, I think that's a really good segue to price tests and how you think about that. And I was thinking about price tests the other day because we've done a gazillion of them over the years. And they're kind of this elusive thing where it seems like this is an easy thing to do. Oh, you just change the number, doesn't cost you that much, but the implications are really big. And the frustrating thing, you have per your hat, is that generating data in a B2B upmarket environment just takes a long time. It's not like we're running Facebook ads for an e-commerce product where you get a result like 2 days later. So can you talk about price tests a little bit and how you think about developing them and running them and so on?
So we don't, I wouldn't consider us to be scientists in pricing, especially as it relates to how it interacts with clients. Where we really focus is making sure that as an agency, as a service provider, you understand what the margin needs to look like on whatever price it is that you're charging to your clients. Because of course, like Adam Newman at WeWork, you could figure out that people are willing to pay $200 a month for $1,000 a month office space. But that's not necessarily going to be helpful to your business. In fact, it could be really detrimental to your business to discover that and pursue it without actually having an understanding of what the unit economics look like underneath that thing. So the thing that we really get focused on is looking at a company's business model, understanding how much they do spend on overhead, how much it costs them to acquire a customer, what their profitability goals are, what their growth goals are, and then determining what the delivery margin or gross margin of that business needs to look like. So every time they sell something, they can set themselves up to be in a position to accomplish that margin and always know what that number is before they sell anything. And also always know what that number is as they evaluate different pricing tests that they may run. And then from there, you get into the can of worms, as you noted, of how do you set up tests? How do you get enough volume through that test to actually determine if it's working or not, especially when you have long sales cycles or you have, kind of a retainer component and you're trying to evaluate how this pricing is going to influence retention. That does get very complicated. And I would point people towards my good friend Bill Wilson from Pace Pricing, who has incredible content on this. And this is what he does for a living, is he helps people do pricing research and price testing. And Patrick Campbell from formerly Price Intelligently, which was acquired by Paddle. He's got a ton of great thought leadership on this as well. And so I would say go consume what they're doing, because they've forgotten more about pricing than I will know in my lifetime as it relates to how to de-risk the exercise of figuring out what people will actually pay for, how much, how they're going to feel about it, and how to package things so that it makes sense to them, et cetera.
Yeah, I think that B2Bs can take way more lessons from B2Cs when it comes to this sort of thing, because we all just assume everything's boring and dry, and there's no magic in how you position pricing. So I think that's important. You mentioned retainers. To bring this to a simple question, are you more or less bullish than you used to be on retainers since you started the business?
I mean, personally, we have really kind of moved in that direction, not because it's self-serving, although it is nice to have recurring revenue for a lot of reasons, and I can get into what those reasons are, but mostly because what we've realized is that the problem that we solve is a process and not an event. And so it just lends itself better to the actual delivery model that is best for clients. But then if you look at just objectively, like retainers being good for service-based business, there's two reasons for that. The first is that it creates recurring revenue, which significantly de-risks the business and is very good for enterprise value. The second is that every time you find a way to increase profitability, that has a compounding return on investment. So it's like if you can figure out a way to shave 10% of the time that it takes you to get something done for a client off, then you get to benefit from that every month in perpetuity, and often across all of your clients that require that thing to get done for them. So there's a lot of reasons that I like retainers, but that's one of the biggest ones, is the return on investment for investing in process, for profitability improvements, is compounding. And it also allows you to, if you kind of max out how many clients your business can handle, you can start to practice this thing that I call revenue replacement, which is when you reach the point wherein the next client that you sell will force you to hire more people, you stop, you take that contract, you go evaluate how profitable all of your clients are, and you go to your least profitable client and you renegotiate their deal. And you say, hey, client, I'm concerned that under the scope of this agreement, we just can't continue to meet your needs. This is what would need to be true for us to continue to support you. And if that doesn't work for you, I totally understand. I think we should find you a partner that's going to be able to meet these needs going forward. And so if they leave, you replace that client with a client that's more profitable. And if they stay, you move up the chain, and now you have two clients that have a higher amount of profitability. And you do that until all of the, what I would call indigestion, has been removed from the business. So then when you do finally go and grow the team and hire that next person, you're doing so from a place of having really strong cash flow, really strong profitability, lots of oxygen essentially in the business. And you do that without really having any risk. Whereas like when you sell projects, as you know, you're kind of constantly living and dying by those projects. And so the risk profile of trying to increase your pricing or renegotiate with a client is exponentially higher, because a lot of times you can't really afford to miss out on project opportunities. There are very finite moments where you have more work than you know what to do with when you run a project-based firm. So that's one of the biggest reasons that I like recurring revenue in the agency from a pricing model perspective.
Yeah, I think what we've seen lately is sort of a move to start with something else, because closing somebody into this infinite loop is maybe harder than it's used to be.
Yes.
But
there definitely is, I think, a hesitancy for people to like commit to long-term engagements. And so we do see a very common model of like, there's some kind of an upfront initial engagement. We do that too. We have the option to work with us like on an initial engagement to evaluate the business and really get clear on where the opportunities are before we roll into that ongoing thing. But to your point earlier on positioning, and that's a big part of the reason that that's important, because to the degree that somebody comes in, having a high degree of trust that you actually know how to solve this problem, the likelihood that they're willing to commit to an ongoing thing is higher, especially if, again, it's not contrived. If you're trying to sell people into a retainer because it's better for you, but it doesn't actually help them get a better result, then that's probably not going to work very well. And so I'm really a strong believer of, in any business, you have to start by really being honest about what is the best solution to this problem for this client, and then look at what your pricing and delivery and business model should be based on that. Because if those two things are in tension with one another, then that's typically where you're going to end up with these real challenges scaling the business.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I have kind of a corny question for you. So if there was, a hypothetical personal finance accountant and they saw the 50-foot yacht on most balance sheets, they'd be like, "What the hell are you doing for all but the richest of rich people?" Is there any agency equivalent of the 50-foot yacht that you
When you
see?
say the 50-foot yacht, are you kind of referring to like basically people trying to decrease their taxable income in ways that are not actually indicative of how the business operates? Or is there a different analogy that you're making there?
Different analogy. I was thinking of it in a way dumber way, just like a stupid expense that you see too many people making.
A stupid expense that we see too many people making. To be honest, like most agencies that we have seen are really quite disciplined about their overhead spending. Like I mentioned before, it's very rare that once we actually account for all of the tax efficiency expenses that we see, right? So like the founder running a whole bunch of personal expenses through the business just to basically reduce the amount of tax that they're paying, which are not real, right? Those are not real operating expenses of the business. Let's just be clear. So when we strip all of that out and we look at like how fundamentally healthy is this business actually, very rarely do we find that agencies are spending way more money than they should on the business. I would argue that if anything is sort of egregious in 2024, it's like having an office. It's clearly not necessary. But again, if you have strong enough delivery margins and you value that as a founder more than that money going into your pocket each month, that's your prerogative. Like, who am I to tell you that you shouldn't be doing that? The most common problem, the stupidest expense is being overstaffed at a given point in time, having way more capacity than you need to do delivery work, maintaining a low utilization. And it's hard because it's emotional, but like basically hanging on to talent on your team that might be really good, that you might really love working with, that might be really good human beings, but basically subsidizing having them in the business when you don't actually have the work to justify it. That's the most common problem that we see. And I think it's harsh to call it a stupid expense, but it's by far the leading cause of low profitability, cash constraints, and turmoil inside of an agency from our experience.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And before we threw on the recorder, you were kind of talking about scaling your team and growing over the last couple of years. Are there any of these lessons that you've had to relearn yourself? And what are those?
Yeah, I think the lesson that we're constantly having to learn is like the best place to operate from as a service-based business is a place where you have more interest in working with you than you have the capacity to take on. And I think as founders, we get really wrapped up in this idea of trying to grow revenue and trying to grow as fast as possible. But the unfortunate reality is when we are desperate for work and when we have time that's going to go unutilized, we have very little leverage in terms of the price that we charge clients, very little leverage in terms of saying no to the wrong fit stuff, very little leverage in terms of pushing back on clients that may actually leave if they don't agree with us, but we're doing that because it's actually what's in the best interest of the client engagement. I would argue that we are actually better suited to serve our customers when we're operating from this place of saying like we have more clients that want to work with us than we have the capacity to work with them because we can be honest with them and we can do what consultants are supposed to do, which is push back on clients and protect them from themselves. But when we are desperate for work, we tend to undercharge. We tend to be hawkish about pushing back on clients and fighting for what's actually in their best interest. We tend to take on things that are not a good fit for the company. And all of those things make the business less enjoyable to run, make it less profitable, and often actually are at a detriment to our clients because we are not operating at the level that we should be as an agency. We're stressed out. We're doing things that are not our core thing. So underneath that, the lesson is trying to grow too fast, going out and hiring before you should, and like being afraid of leaving money and opportunity on the table is the lesson that I continue to relearn and I see so many agency owners struggle with. And in my opinion, if you're trying to optimize for a profitable and enjoyable agency, be okay with leaving some work on the table because that's the best, like I said, the best place to be operating from. You have the most leverage, you have the most optionality. So be okay with being a little constrained on resources if that's the context you want to be living in.
Yeah, and I think that you're, a big benefit towards that because it's one thing to know that rationally, it's another thing to actually see all the evidence for it. It's one thing to know that gravity exists. It's another thing to have the equations to see why the rock falls back down when you throw it in the air. So you guys are doing great stuff in that realm. And getting towards the end of our time, what's keeping you busy over the next few months and where can people go to learn more?
Yeah. Well, we've been growing really quickly. So it's funny, we just talked about this, but like we just made a deliberate decision to grow our team and increase the capacity we have to take on clients, but it's coming after a long period of having more people that want to work with us than we had time to work with. And I'm really excited because we are making a lot of investments in our technology platform. And, to come back to the thing I talked about earlier, what we've realized is that people need clean data and they need a framework for how to measure their business, right? Like you talk about something like a utilization rate. You ask 10 agencies what their utilization is, they'll give you 10 different answers and they'll all calculate it 10 different ways. And that is problematic because then we don't know actually what the metric is telling us. We don't know how to act on it. We don't know how to interpret it. And so we've really spent a lot of time the last couple of years investing in our framework and formalizing that and really simplifying how we teach it so we can take that to market and just educate people on what they should measure and how, and then building technology that actually helps measuring it operationally feasible and affordable and reasonable for small agencies. And so that's a lot of the stuff that you're going to start seeing a lot more of from us over the next few quarters as we just try to like take our framework for solving this problem in 2024 and beyond and just get it out to more people.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We'll get all that linked up. Marcel, always a pleasure, man. Let's do it again. And yeah, we'll talk soon.
Thank you, Dan.